The following content is provided by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Libraries under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license. For more information, go to libraries.mit.edu/creativecommons.
Hello, I'm Ellen Duranzo, Scholarly Publishing and Licensing Consultant in the MIT Libraries. This is the latest in a series of podcasts on topics related to scholarly publishing and copyright. Today we'll hear from Professor George Stiny, Professor of Design and Computation in the Department of Architecture at MIT. He explains the significance of copying in the design process from his unusual perspective, a perspective that blends art and design with calculating. Professor Stiny invented shape grammars, the idea of identifying and quantifying a set of rules that can generate an infinite range of designs, much the way rules of grammar in language can generate an infinite range of sentences. His work uses mathematics to capture the creative, generative language of shapes and design. Professor Stiny, your work in the architecture department focuses on computation as applied to the grammar of shapes. In your book, Shape, Talking About Seeing and Doing, you say that you really can't just tell people you're a shape grammarist as someone might report being an architect, accountant, engineer, or doctor. You say you've given up on a set reply to questions about what you do. Nevertheless, can you explain this intriguing idea of shape grammars to us in simple terms?
Thank you for giving me the chance to talk about shape grammars and their uses in a novel way in terms of copying. Shape grammars rely on copying to calculate and to say something about creativity in art and design. This already sounds pretty improbable, to connect copying, calculating, and creativity. But copying may not be as empty as it seems, and calculating can do some pretty surprising things. There's a lot to get from both of them, so let's begin. What are shape grammars? Well, shape grammars are a way to calculate by seeing instead of counting. When you count the same things over and over again, your answer doesn't change. But in a shape grammar, what's there depends on what you see, and this changes whenever you look. For example, suppose I combine three triangles. If I represent these with three symbols, their names, then there are always just three. But if the triangles are shapes, I may also see two without having anticipated this. This kind of reconfiguration on the fly, the Gestalt switch, is possible because shapes have things embedded in them. Anything I can trace out with my finger or draw on a piece of tracing paper and overlay to match what's underneath is there. My triangles go together to make a shape in which they fuse. But they aren't units. In fact, shapes don't have units. Triangles disappear when they combine. So I'm free to see shapes in any way I like. Shape grammars let me calculate without units that limit what I can see. Changing what you see is common in modern art too. Marcel Duchamp is famous for a kind of plagiarism, it's his term, where he takes everyday things and turns them into something new, sometimes simply by seeing them in another way. His fountain is a notorious example. Picasso does this too, although not as parsimoniously. And in an ominous term, the surrealist Salvador Dali has his own paranoid critical method, in which your paranoid capacity is a measure of how many ways you can see the same thing. Long before this, during the Italian Renaissance, Alberti and Leonardo da Vinci looked for images in rocks and trees and clouds, and for landscapes in smudges and stains on walls, the result of throwing a sponge filled with paint or a fresh plaster drying. Alberti thought that seeing in this way was the origin of art. The shape grammarist takes this idea seriously and tries to show how it makes sense calculating with shapes and rules. The key question is this: what would calculating be like if Turing, the inventor of modern computing, had been a painter instead of a logician? The trick is to show that design is calculating, without diminishing either term in this formula, so that calculating includes design, and design is more than a combinatorial or compositional undertaking that's merely a complicated way of counting. I might also add that there are some other nice relationships between calculating with symbols by counting and calculating with shapes by seeing. First, calculating with symbols is a special case of calculating with shapes. The kind of design I'm going to be talking about includes the compositional kind of design common in engineering and computer science. And then calculating with shapes can sometimes be approximated with symbols. I can calculate in the usual way without giving up on seeing.
So your work then shows that design is calculating with shapes, and you define rules for copying shapes. Is that right? Can you say more about the role of copying in your work and in design in general?
I've already mentioned Duchamp's plagiarism and Dali's paranoia, and there's plenty of copying in both. But copying keeps better company as well. It's involved in shape grammars and their uses too. In a shape grammar, a rule is two shapes, A and B, It goes like this. If I can find a copy of A, say in a line drawing, then I can replace it with a copy of B. Because I don't know what's in the drawing until I try the rule, that is to say until I look, copies can pop up almost any place in surprising ways. With this simple idea, I can give rules to produce known designs in a given style, say Chinese ice ray lattices for window grills or Palladian villa plans, and new examples of the style. We're so good at this that experts have a hard time distinguishing originals and fakes. And I can use rules to get designs from scratch and to show how styles change. All of this because I can calculate with shapes and rules. Copying is how rules work, and using rules to copy what artists and designers have done helps me understand their work. In fact, I can go on to new designs of my own to show what I've learned and what I can do by myself. The big question, of course, is what it means to copy something. How do you decide what it is? Suppose you draw 3 triangles, and I copy what you've done by drawing 2 triangles. Have we drawn the same thing or seen it in the same way? How could anyone tell just by looking at what we've done? Perhaps someone else sees rhombuses and trapezoids. Is this plagiarism? It's easy to cook up a design exercise. There are a dime a dozen, with or without explicit rules, in which everyone hands in the same drawing. Xerox copies are fine, and has a wildly different answer. This is what seeing allows, and why calculating with shapes and rules is so neat. But then does it pay to worry about copying? It's nice to insist that students do their own work, but this may not be what you want. Copying is hard to avoid, and it may be what you need, certainly if you're going to calculate. There's no way to cheat when what you see is always your own. That's what shapes and rules show. Seeing is always your own. At the very least, copying is a good way to learn to see, and for me, seeing is where art and design begin, and the way they go on. Alberti got it right for smudges and stains. I'm ready to include whatever we design and make, copies included.
So you've gone it so far as to say that design is a kind of forgery. Does all human creativity or all design involve copying?
Well, certainly when you give rules to produce things in a historical style, say Palladian villas, the goal is forgery. When people, including the experts, are confused about what's original and what's new, you know you're getting it right. You're on the way to understanding the style. But more than this, copying is everywhere you look in design. Copying is what it means to work in a style. Either you copy yourself or you copy and extend the work of others, perhaps in a workshop or school. The classical orders are copied all over the place in architecture. Things like brand identity and product design depend on copying, and so does reverse engineering. More technically, rules let me copy part of a design I'm working on and add it to what I'm doing. Paul Klee and the architect Alvor Aalto, he did MIT's Baker House, work in this way. It's hard for me to imagine any kind of design without copying of some kind. It's best practice. It's where new ideas come from, and it's how they develop. I'm often asked about creativity and whether or not it's possible with shapes and rules. I've tried a lot of answers, but only one of them avoids an argument and allows for some kind of agreement, and it reassures art and design students. Creativity has something to do with copying. Copying is more than it seems. There's really nothing rote about it. It includes new ways of looking at things, and that's what it means to be creative, or so I'm told, and that's what it means to calculate with shapes and rules. I suppose there are things that can be created without copying, but I'm not exactly sure how. Copying and creativity go hand in hand. When you copy something, you're being creative, and when you're being creative, it's useful to start by copying. There's another view of creativity, the generative view, that you've touched on already. It comes from linguistics and artificial intelligence. It goes like this. Creativity is recursion. There are words to start with, and then there are rules to combine words in new ways to say new things. This is really a neat idea when you play around with it, with words or units of other kind, perhaps colored blocks or parametric components. But it may not convince artists and designers, because words and units don't change when they're combined. But shapes change when what's there depends on tracing paper and the kind of embedding I mentioned before. Recursion is only half the story. Creativity depends on embedding as well. In a shape grammar, rules combine shapes. There's recursion. And the same rules let you change what you see without knowing in advance what the possibilities for change are. There's embedding. I can add shapes together so that they fuse and then divide what I get so that the shapes I've added disappear. I can make big changes simply by looking. In fact, every time I try a rule, I'm seeing in a new way. There's no way around this. It's how rules work, and it makes copying creative.
So you've speculated that if copying were prohibited, the enterprise of design would no longer be possible. Can you say more about this?
I've probably said too much already, but I enjoy talking almost as much as I enjoy seeing. It's fun to see how far you can go. So let's continue. Certainly, if copying were banned, I couldn't calculate with shapes and rules. That's how shape grammars work. So my claim that design is calculating would collapse. Maybe that's a bonus. More seriously, though, copying is indispensable in teaching and practice. Students learn from, that's a polite way to say copy, the work of others, including other students. Design studios and architecture are a good example of this. It's amazing how fast independent work can start to look the same. And there are implications for creative practice as well. Where do artists and designers get new ideas? By now you've probably guessed that I believe that art and design are observational. That is to say, they depend on seeing. The idea is to wander around, to look at whatever you want, and to use what you see. But if you can't copy it, you probably can't use it. Oh, I suppose there's some clever way to handle this, but it sure makes it difficult to go on. It also seems to separate design and seeing, and that's not what I want.
So in the beginning of your book, Shape, you say that shapes are always ambiguous. And in our prior conversations too, I have the sense that ambiguity is a critical concept for your work and for you. Can you explain why and how?
You're right. I like ambiguity, and I try to use it whenever I can. It's a big part of what I do. In fact, ambiguity is inherent in shapes and impossible to avoid if you take seeing seriously. That's why my rules require embedding to take advantage of this. Of course, there's ambiguity in words too. I've been talking about copying in different ways without trying to define it. Copying is ambiguous, its meaning changes, and it's probably a useful word because of this. I'm not trying to be clear, I'm just enjoying our conversation. It's about going on. Clarity and definitions, for what they're worth, are retrospective. There's times for them once we're done. But some of the people I talk to think this is nuts. Ambiguity is a dirty word. You're supposed to get rid of it. That's the whole point of logic and calculating, to get rid of ambiguity once and for all. Ambiguity may work in poetry and puns, but it's usually embarrassing elsewhere, and maybe even dangerous. It shows weakness when it's caught. Maybe not. Ambiguity is crucial in design. In design, the idea is to calculate without knowing exactly what you're doing. Otherwise, there's nothing to design. You've already decided what to do. And that's what my rules are for. Seeing is shot through with ambiguity, and my rules use it to calculate. It's why drawings are so important. They're out there and not just in my head. I have to look at them to use them, and I can look at the same thing over and over again and never run out of new things to see. In fact, the way my rules work, there's always something new whenever they're tried. I don't have to worry about getting stuck when I calculate, because there's always another rule that lets me go on. Because I can use ambiguity, I don't have to keep to what I've done when I'm calculating. I can change my mind and strike out in a new direction at any time. Nothing is fixed. That's my kind of design, and that's why it's calculating.
Well, you're clearly passionate not only about your work, but the significance of the idea of copying within your work and all design. As we close then, can I ask, what would you most like those outside the design world to understand about copying?
That's really easy. Copying is like ambiguity. It isn't something to get rid of, it's something to use. And because of ambiguity, copying is creative. That's pretty clear. Because shapes are ambiguous, I can never be sure about what you've drawn, and you can't control what I see. Whenever I look, there's something new, so what I copy is my own. I've been trying to tell you about this and how it works with shapes and rules. It's all about using what you see. Copying simply isn't something to worry about, and it isn't something to prohibit or discourage. Copying isn't bad. It's a great way to learn, and it's a great way to get new ideas. Sometimes it's how to design.
Well, Professor Stiny, your thoughts today have given us a whole new way to view the right to copy, the copy and copyright. Thanks so much for spending time offering us your unique perspective today. We very much appreciate it. This is Ellen Duranso. If listeners would like to know more about Professor Stiny's work, they can see the website architecture.mit.edu or pick up his book by MIT Press in 2006, Shape. If you have any questions or feedback about this or related topics, please give me a call at extension 38483 or consult the Scholarly Publishing website at libraries.mit.edu/scholarly. Thanks for listening today.